The new Michael Jackson documentary, The Verdict, on Netflix has set the world on fire. Fans are calling for a boycott of Netflix. The innocent glove picture is popping up all over social media, and people are speculating the documentary is the
Breaking albums, sold-out concerts, and worldwide fame was a controversy that changed how millions of people saw him forever. Years later, a documentary brought those accusations back into the spotlight. But critics claimed something important was missing. Hidden details, public records, and unanswered questions started a new battle over one question. Did the world see the full story? For years, many people believed the Michael Jackson story had already been told. The accusations, the investigations, the trial, and the headlines seemed like history. Then a new documentary arrived and changed everything. Suddenly, old arguments returned. Fans were fighting online. News outlets for decades. Michael Jackson was known as the king of pop. But behind the record, we're covering the story again. Millions of people were asking the same question. Did the documentary tell the whole truth, or only part of it? The answer is far more complicated than most people realize. Michael Jackson was not just a singer. He was one of the most famous entertainers in human history. His music crossed borders, languages, and generations. Albums like Thriller, Bad, and Dangerous made him a global icon. But alongside that success came years of controversy. When Netflix released The Verdict, many viewers expected a complete breakdown of the allegations that had followed Jackson for decades. The documentary presented claims, testimony, and emotional accounts that painted a powerful picture. For some viewers, the film seemed convincing. For others, it raised a different question. What information was included? And more importantly, what information was left out? That question became the center of a worldwide debate. Almost immediately, fans, journalists, lawyers, and researchers began examining the documentary frame by frame. Some argued it highlighted important voices that deserved to be heard. Others claimed it ignored court records, timelines, and evidence that complicated the story. The discussion quickly spread across social media. Old interviews resurfaced. Legal documents were shared online. Television panels debated the case again. People who had never followed the Michael Jackson controversy suddenly found themselves trying to separate facts from opinions. And that was not easy, because unlike many celebrity scandals, this story stretches across decades. It involves investigations, lawsuits, sworn testimony, media coverage, and thousands of pages of public records. Before anyone can decide whether the verdict got the story right or wrong, one thing has to happen first. We need to understand exactly what the documentary claimed. And once those claims are placed next to the public record, the real investigation begins. Before we get there, here's a question for you. Because in the next chapter, we'll examine the biggest claims made in the documentary, and the evidence that supporters and critics say tells a very different story. The documentary's strongest weapon was not documents or courtroom footage. It was emotion. Viewers were introduced to personal stories, painful memories, and deeply emotional accounts. The film focused on allegations that Michael Jackson had behaved inappropriately with young boys, and presented these stories in a way that encouraged viewers to see the events through the eyes of the accusers. For many people watching, the impact was immediate. The stories felt personal. The emotions felt real. And that is exactly why the documentary sparked such a strong reaction. But critics argued that emotion alone cannot answer historical questions. They said the claims needed to be examined alongside court records, investigations, witness testimony, and verified timelines. That is where the debate became much more complicated. One major criticism involved the way certain events were presented. Researchers and Jackson supporters pointed to public records that appeared to conflict with parts of the timeline discussed in the documentary. For example, several investigators and journalists noted that some locations mentioned during key allegations were either unavailable or did not exist in the form described at the time certain events were said to have happened. Supporters of the documentary argued that memory can be imperfect, especially when people are describing events from many years earlier. Critics responded that timelines matter because they help establish whether claims can be verified. And this was only the beginning. Questions also emerged about witnesses. Over the years, multiple individuals connected to Michael Jackson made statements supporting him. Some testified under oath. Others spoke publicly after investigations ended. Critics of the documentary argued that many of these voices received little attention. Why? Was it because their testimony weakened the documentary's narrative? Or was it because filmmakers believed those accounts were less important? The answer depends on who you ask. Then there were the investigations themselves. Many viewers did not realize that Michael Jackson had been investigated by law enforcement agencies over several years. Homes were searched, computers were examined, financial records were reviewed, witnesses were interviewed. These investigations generated enormous amounts of material. Yet critics argued that much of this context received limited discussion compared to the personal accounts featured in the film. That criticism led to an even bigger question. If investigators spent years examining the allegations, what did they actually find? And perhaps more importantly, what happened when the most famous case against Michael Jackson finally reached a courtroom? Because once lawyers, witnesses, and evidence entered the picture, the story became far more complicated than many people expected. And what happened during that trial still shapes this debate today. After the trial ended, many people assumed the debate around Michael Jackson would slowly fade away. Instead, it took on a new life. Years later, documentaries, articles, podcasts, and online discussions brought the controversy back into public view. Every new project seemed to divide audiences into two groups: those who believed important accusations deserved continued attention, and those who believed key facts were being ignored. This is where the idea of the receipts entered the conversation. When critics of documentaries like The Verdict talk about receipts, they usually mean public records, court filings, trial transcripts, investigation documents, interviews, timelines, and statements made under oath. Their argument is not necessarily that every allegation can be disproven. Their argument is that viewers should also see information that complicates a story. For example, critics often point to the years-long investigations conducted by law enforcement agencies. They note that authorities searched properties, reviewed materials, interviewed witnesses, and spent enormous resources examining allegations. Supporters of Jackson argue that these investigations are important because they provide context that many casual viewers never see. Another issue involves timelines. Researchers have spent years comparing public claims against records, photographs, travel schedules, construction dates, and other documents. In some cases, critics argue that certain claims become harder to support when placed against documented timelines. Supporters of the documentaries often respond with an important point. Human memory is not perfect. People can remember events incorrectly while still believing their overall experiences were real. This disagreement remains one of the biggest dividing lines in the debate. Then there are former associates, employees, friends, and investigators who publicly defended Jackson over the years. Critics argue that many of these voices receive less attention than accusers. Supporters of the documentaries argue that filmmakers must make choices about which perspectives are most relevant to the story they are telling. And that brings us to a larger issue. How do you tell the story of a person as famous as Michael Jackson? Do you focus on allegations? Do you focus on court outcomes? Do you focus on the people making claims? Or do you try to include every conflicting piece of information? The truth is that no documentary can include everything. But the choices filmmakers make can strongly influence how audiences understand a story. And that is exactly why the Michael Jackson debate refuses to disappear. Because for many people, this discussion is no longer just about Michael Jackson. It is about media. It is about evidence. It is about trust. And it is about how history gets remembered. Most people watching this have experienced a situation where they felt misunderstood, judged, or defined by only one part of their story. Maybe not on a global stage, but in your own life. That is one reason this debate continues to resonate with so many people. But before we reach the final verdict on the documentary itself, there's one last question to answer. What has all of this done to Michael Jackson's legacy? And why does the argument seem stronger today than ever before? In the end, the verdict did not settle the Michael Jackson debate. If anything, it made it bigger. Years after his death, Michael Jackson remains one of the most famous and most discussed entertainers in history. His music still reaches new generations. His videos continue to attract millions of views. His influence can be seen in artists across pop, R&B, dance, and even modern social media culture. Yet alongside that legacy stands a controversy that refuses to disappear. That is the reality of Michael Jackson's story. For some people, the allegations will always shape how they view him. For others, the investigations, court proceedings, and acquittal remain central facts that cannot be ignored. And between those positions are millions of people still trying to understand what happened. That is why documentaries about Michael Jackson generate so much attention. They are not simply about a celebrity. They are about how people decide what to believe. They are about the relationship between emotion and evidence. They are about whether public opinion should be shaped by personal testimony, legal outcomes, media narratives, or some combination of all three. The reason these questions matter is simple. Michael Jackson's story is larger than one person. It has become a case study in how modern society processes accusations, fame, justice, and public memory. Supporters argue that his acquittal, years of investigations, and the absence of criminal convictions deserve greater attention. Critics argue that legal outcomes do not automatically answer every question surrounding allegations. Both sides continue to present evidence they believe supports their position. And that is exactly why the debate remains alive decades later. But perhaps the most important lesson is this. Whenever a documentary tells a story, especially one involving controversy, it is worth asking what was included, what was excluded, and why. Not because every documentary is wrong, but because complex stories rarely fit into a single narrative. Michael Jackson's life was filled with extraordinary success, global fame, personal struggles, legal battles, and endless public scrutiny. No single film can fully capture all of it. That is why people continue searching for answers, and why discussions like this continue years after the final courtroom verdict. Whether you believe the verdict presented a fair picture or left out important facts, one thing is certain. The Michael Jackson story is still being debated, and it may continue to be debated for generations to come. But this is not the end of the story. The next chapter in the Michael Jackson debate reveals even more surprising details about the media coverage, public reactions, and the evidence that continues to divide fans and critics around the world. The video